Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Detective Raymond Ray Morrison had seen enough broken families in his 15 years on the force to know that monsters often wore familiar faces. But he never expected to find one sleeping beside him every night. At 38, Ray was a man carved from granite and bitter experience. His angular jaw bore a scar from a knife fight with a meth dealer 3 years prior, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. Colleagues respected his methodical approach to cases and his reputation for never letting criminals slip through procedural cracks. What they didn't know was that Ray's obsession with justice stemmed from his own childhood, watching his alcoholic father abuse his mother until the bastard finally drank himself to death. Ray had built his life on control and order. His house in the suburbs was immaculate, his finances precise, his career trajectory planned to the year. When he met Lila Hensley at a charity fundraiser 5 years ago, she seemed to fit perfectly into his structured world. She was a pediatric nurse with warm brown eyes and a gentle laugh that made him believe in softness again. Lila was 28 then, fresh from a messy divorce with a deadbeat musician. She spoke of wanting stability, a real family, someone reliable. Ray thought he was saving her. Now, as he stood in his kitchen reviewing case files at 6 a.m., he wondered who had really been the prey. Their daughter Emma had been the brightest light in Ray's carefully constructed life. At 2 years old, she had Lila's brown eyes but Ray's stubborn chin. She would toddle after him when he came home from work, babbling "dada" and reaching up with tiny arms. For the first time since childhood, Ray felt something approaching peace. But lately, something had shifted in his house like a fault line preparing to rupture. Lila had grown distant over the past 6 months, taking extra shifts at the hospital, whispering into her phone in the bathroom, claiming exhaustion when Ray reached for her at night. She'd started going to book club every Wednesday, though Ray had never seen her crack a novel. When he'd casually mentioned checking the book she was supposedly reading, Lila had snapped at him with uncharacteristic venom. Ray's detective instincts were screaming, but he'd pushed them down. This was his wife, his family, the thing he'd built to replace the chaos of his childhood. He couldn't let paranoia destroy it. That morning, as Lila rushed around the kitchen preparing for another early shift, Ray studied her profile. She was still beautiful. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, scrubs that couldn't hide her curves, but there was a tension in her movements that hadn't been there before. "I might be late tonight," she said without looking at him. "Dr. Gutierrez asked me to cover the evening shift in pediatric ICU. Ray nodded, filing away the information. Dr. Gutierrez was 63 years old with a wife and grandchildren. Not exactly affair material, but someone was. "I'll pick up Emma from daycare then," he said. Lila's hand paused on her coffee mug. "Actually, I already arranged for my mom to get her. I might need to work really late." Another lie. Lila's mother was in Phoenix, visiting her sister. Ray had seen the Facebook photos yesterday, but he simply nodded and kissed Lila's cheek, tasting the deception on her skin. After she left, Ray sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by crime scene photos from his latest case. A domestic violence murder where the husband had beaten his wife to death with a tire iron. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years putting monsters in cages, never realizing he'd invited one into his bed. Chapter 2, Fractures in Paradise. Dr. Travis Kellerman had always been good at reading people's vulnerabilities. At 35, he possessed the kind of easy charm that made patients trust him and nurses linger near his desk. Tall and lean with practiced stubble and expressive green eyes, he knew exactly how handsome he was and wielded it like a surgical instrument. Travis specialized in pediatric emergency medicine at St. Mary's Hospital, where his reputation for saving children's lives made him untouchable. What his colleagues didn't know was that Travis saw children as opportunities rather than patients. Not in the way the hospital's background checks were designed to catch. He wasn't a predator in that sense. But he understood that desperate parents would do anything for their sick children, and desperate women were his specialty. He'd been seducing married nurses for years, always choosing women with something to lose. The game wasn't just about sex. It was about power, about proving he could dismantle any life he chose. Lila Morrison had been his greatest challenge yet. When Lila first started working pediatric ICU 6 months ago, Travis had immediately spotted her tells. The wedding ring she twisted when nervous, the way she flinched when other nurses mentioned their husbands' jobs, the careful distance she maintained from male colleagues. She was armor-plated against men like him, which only made her more irresistible. The campaign had taken weeks of careful groundwork. First, he'd establish himself as safe, seeking her opinion on difficult cases, praising her competence to supervisors, never crossing professional boundaries. When her daughter Emma had come to the ER with a high fever one evening, Travis had personally overseen her care, staying late to ensure everything was perfect. Lila's gratitude had cracked the first fissure in her defenses. The real breakthrough came when Travis mentioned his own difficult divorce and how hard it was to trust again. A complete fabrication. He'd never been married, but Lila had responded with her own story of disappointment and fear of being controlled. Travis had listened with practiced empathy, offering just enough vulnerability to make her feel safe while gathering intelligence on her marriage. Now, as he prepared for another Wednesday evening with Lila, Travis felt the familiar thrill of approaching victory. She was completely under his spell, believing herself to be in love with a man who didn't exist. Tonight, he planned to escalate things, to push her toward leaving her husband entirely. The irony was delicious. Ray Morrison, the celebrated detective who'd sent dozens of criminals to prison, couldn't even see the one dismantling his life from the inside. Travis had researched Ray extensively, reading news articles about his cases, studying his reputation for ruthless efficiency. The man was dangerous when pursuing criminals, but apparently blind to threats in his own home. Most men were, in Travis's experience. They built their lives around assumptions of loyalty and love, never realizing these were just tools to be exploited. That evening, Travis waited in the parking lot of the Riverside Hotel, watching Lila's car pull into the space beside his BMW. She told Ray she was working late again. The lies came easier now, each deception making the next one smoother. As Lila approached his car, Travis noted the guilt still etched in her features. Good. Guilt made women malleable, desperate to prove their feelings were justified. He planned to use that guilt to his advantage tonight. "You look beautiful," he said as she slipped into his passenger seat, leaning over to kiss her neck. Lila melted into his touch, and Travis smiled against her skin. Soon, she'd be willing to do anything for him, even abandon her daughter if necessary. Because that was the real game Travis was playing, not just seducing another man's wife, but destroying an entire family. Ray Morrison's reputation for putting criminals behind bars made him a particularly satisfying target. Travis wondered how the detective would handle being the victim for once. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. Ray Morrison wasn't a man who believed in coincidences. 20 years of police work had taught him that patterns revealed truth, and the pattern emerging around his wife was growing impossible to ignore. He'd started documenting Lila's behavior 3 weeks ago, not because he wanted to, but because his instincts demanded it. The same methodical approach that made him an excellent detective now turned inward, dissecting his own life with surgical precision. The evidence was damning. 12 late shifts that weren't on the hospital staff schedule. Credit card charges at restaurants she claimed never to have visited. A new lingerie set hidden in the back of her drawer that she'd never worn for him. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. But Ray was a careful man. He needed proof, not suspicion. So he begun following her. The first Wednesday, he'd watched Lila's Honda Civic pull into the Riverside Hotel parking lot. She'd sat there for 10 minutes before a silver BMW pulled up beside her. Ray had used his telephoto lens to photograph the license plate and a man who emerged, tall, dark-haired, expensive clothes. A quick DMV search revealed Dr. Travis Kellerman, unmarried, no criminal record. The second Wednesday, Ray had booked a room 3 floors above theirs and confirmed what he already knew in his gut. His wife was fucking another man. But knowledge wasn't enough. Ray needed leverage. Tonight was the third Wednesday, and Ray had prepared meticulously. He'd installed tracking software on Lila's phone weeks ago, a trick learned from domestic violence cases where victims needed evidence of stalking. Now he had copies of every text message, every deleted photo, every whispered phone call. The messages revealed more than just adultery. They showed Travis Kellerman's true nature, his manipulation, his cruelty, his obvious contempt for both Lila and Emma. In one particularly vicious exchange, Travis had called Emma a burden and suggested Lila would need to choose between her daughter and their future together. That message had changed everything for Ray. This wasn't just about a cheating wife anymore. This was about a predator who threatened his child. As Ray sat in his surveillance van watching the hotel, his phone buzzed with a text from the department. Another domestic violence case, a mother who'd accidentally broken her 3-year-old's arm. Ray stared at the message, something cold crystallizing in his chest. Children were sacred. Anyone who threatened them deserved no mercy. At 9:47 p.m., Lila emerged from the hotel looking disheveled and guilty. Travis kissed her goodbye with the casual possessiveness of a man who thought he'd already won. Ray followed Lila home, arriving a few minutes after her. She was in the shower when he entered, washing away the evidence of her betrayal. He checked on Emma, sleeping peacefully in her crib, and felt his resolve harden into something diamond-sharp. When Lila emerged from the bathroom in her robe, Ray was sitting on their bed, apparently reading case files. "How was work?" he asked without looking up. "Exhausting," she replied, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Lost a patient tonight. 8-year-old car accident victim." Ray nodded sympathetically, making a mental note. There had been no pediatric deaths at St. Mary's in 3 weeks. He checked. Even her cover stories were fabrications now. "I'm sorry, baby," he said, pulling her close. She stiffened slightly at his touch, and Ray felt the last piece of his heart turn to ice. "Why don't you get some sleep? You look tired." As Lila settled beside him, Ray lay awake staring at the ceiling. He thought about the domestic violence cases he'd worked, the patterns of escalation, the moment when victims realized their lives were in danger. But Ray wasn't a victim. He was a predator who'd been sleeping, and his wife had just awakened something far more dangerous than she could imagine. Tomorrow, he would begin planning their destruction. Not just Lila and Travis, but everyone who had enabled this betrayal. By the time Ray Morrison was finished, they would understand what it meant to threaten his daughter. Justice, Ray had learned long ago, wasn't always legal. Sometimes it was personal. Chapter 4, The Catalyst. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos when Ray Morrison burst through the doors carrying his unconscious 2-year-old daughter. Emma's lips were blue, her breathing shallow and labored. Ray's training took over even as panic clawed at his throat. Protect the child, secure the scene, find the truth. "I need help," he shouted, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "My daughter can't breathe." Nurses swarmed them immediately, transferring Emma to a gurney as they rushed toward the trauma bay. Ray kept pace beside them, his detective's mind cataloging every detail while his father's heart screamed. "What happened?" Dr. Susan Chun asked as they worked, inserting in 4 and attaching monitors. "I came home and found her like this," Ray said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "My wife said she fell, but—" The monitors started beeping frantically. Emma's oxygen levels were dangerously low. "Get respiratory therapy down here now," Dr. Chen ordered. "And page Dr. Kellerman. We need pediatric emergency." Ray's blood turned to ice. Travis Kellerman, the man fucking his wife, was about to put his hands on his dying daughter. As if summoned by Ray's darkest thoughts, Travis appeared in the doorway. For a split second, their eyes met, and Ray saw something flicker across the doctor's face, surprise, perhaps even guilt, before professional composure took over. "What do we have?" Travis asked, moving to Emma's bedside with practiced efficiency. 2-year-old female, respiratory distress, possible aspiration, Dr. Chen reported. Travis began his examination, and Ray had to admit the bastard was competent. His hands were gentle but sure as he checked Emma's airways, listened to her breathing, ordered additional tests. Whatever else Travis was, he seemed genuinely concerned about Emma's condition. But then Lila arrived. Ray heard her voice in the hallway before he saw her. That particular pitch of panic every parent recognized. She rushed into the trauma bay, her face white with terror, and immediately went to Emma's side. "Oh God, my baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Is she going to be okay?" It was then that Ray noticed Nurse Patricia Williams. The older woman stood frozen near the supply cabinet, her face drained of color as she stared at Lila. Her hands were trembling so violently she nearly dropped the medication she was holding. "Patricia," Dr. Chun called out. "Are you all right?" The nurse looked up, startled, and her eyes darted between Lila and the exit as if calculating escape routes. I'm fine. Just tired." But Ray wasn't buying it. He'd seen that look before, in witnesses who'd recognized suspects, in victims confronting their attackers. Patricia Williams was terrified of his wife. Why is she here?" Patricia whispered to another nurse. Her voice barely audible, but Ray's trained ears caught every word. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Patricia's terror, Emma's mysterious injuries over the past months that Lila had explained away, the timing of his wife's affair. Ray felt his vision narrow to a tunnel as rage built in his chest like molten steel. "Dr. Kellerman," Ray said, his voice deadly calm, "I need to speak with you privately." Travis looked up from Emma's chart, wariness flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, your daughter needs." "Now," Ray interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. They stepped into the hallway, and Ray used every ounce of his self-control not to slam Travis against the wall. Instead, he spoke in the same measured tone he used when interrogating suspects. "How long have you been fucking my wife?" Travis's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." 6 months, Ray continued as if Travis hadn't spoken. "Every Wednesday at the Riverside Hotel, room 237. You drive a silver BMW, license plate 4HRT 891. You told her Emma was a burden and she'd have to choose between her daughter and you." The color drained from Travis's face. "You're obviously distraught." "What I am," Ray said, stepping closer, "is a man who's discovered his wife is fucking a predator, and that same predator is now treating his daughter. So I'm going to ask you one more time. What do you know about Emma's injuries?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun, because Ray had realized something that made his blood run cold. Travis's medical expertise would make him the perfect accomplice for someone hurting a child. He would know exactly what injuries would look accidental, what symptoms would be dismissed, how to cover up abuse. Travis opened his mouth to respond, but whatever he was about to say was cut off by alarms from Emma's room. They rushed back to find her breathing had worsened. "We need to intubate," Travis said, all pretense of personal drama forgotten in the face of medical crisis. "Give me a size 3 ET tube." As they worked to save Emma's life, Ray stood back and watched his wife. Really watched her. The tears seemed genuine, but there was something else in her expression, a calculation behind the grief that made his stomach turn. When Emma was finally stabilized and breathing steadily with the ventilator's help, Ray made a decision that would change everything. He was going to destroy them all. Chapter 5. Uncovering the Truth. Ray Morrison spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled fury, maintaining the facade of a worried father while conducting the most important investigation of his career. Emma remained in pediatric ICU, sedated and stable, but not yet out of danger. The doctors, led by Travis, ironically, had determined she'd suffered severe respiratory distress due to what appeared to be allergic reaction or possible poisoning. But Ray knew better. He'd seen the needle mark on Emma's arm that the medical staff had dismissed as an for insertion point. The location was wrong, the angle inconsistent with medical procedure. Someone had injected his daughter with something, and Ray had a growing suspicion about who. While Lila maintained her vigil at Emma's bedside, playing the part of the devoted mother, Ray worked his contacts throughout the hospital. 20 years of police work had taught him that institutions were only as strong as their weakest links, and every workplace had employees willing to talk. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Miguel Santos, a janitor who worked the night shift in pediatric ICU. Miguel was undocumented, which made him invisible to most staff, but also meant he noticed everything. His survival depended on it. That nurse, the one with the red hair, Miguel said when Ray cornered him in the supply closet, she comes in sometimes when she's not scheduled. Late at night, when there's only skeleton crew. Lila Morrison? Ray showed him a photo. Miguel nodded. She has access codes, so security doesn't stop her. But I seen her go into rooms when families aren't there. Sometimes she brings things in her purse, little bottles, syringes. Ray felt his world tilt. You saw her inject patients? Not patients, Miguel said, his eyes dark with worry. The 4 bags. She puts something in the 4 bags, then hangs them back up. Next morning, kids get sicker. The janitor pulled out his phone with shaking hands. I started recording because I was scared for the children. My own grandson was patient here last month. The video was grainy but clear enough. Lila, dressed in scrubs, entering room 314 at 2:17 a.m. She approached the 4 stand, withdrew a small vial from her purse, and injected its contents into the saline bag. The timestamp showed this was 3 weeks ago, a night when Lila had told Ray she was working a double shift. What happened to the patient in that room? Ray asked, though he dreaded the answer. Little boy, 5 years old, came in for routine surgery. Developed complications that night, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest. They saved him, but Miguel shrugged helplessly. He's still in coma. Ray's hands clenched into fists. His wife wasn't just an adulteress. She was a serial child abuser. Worse, she was doing it under the guise of medical care, using her position as a nurse to harm the most vulnerable patients. But why? And how did Travis fit into this? The answer came from another source. Hospital records that Ray obtained through unofficial channels. Cross-referencing Lila's work schedule with patient complications revealed a pattern spanning 4 months. Every child who'd suffered mysterious setbacks had been under Lila's care during night shifts. But more tellingly, Travis had been the attending physician for every single case. Munchausen syndrome by proxy, Ray realized with sickening clarity. Lila was making children sick, and Travis was heroically saving them. The medical staff saw Dr. Kellerman as a miracle worker, the man who could save patients when all hope seemed lost. It built his reputation while feeding Lila's need for attention and drama. The affair was just a bonus, 2 psychopaths who'd found each other. But Emma's case was different. This wasn't about medical attention or playing hero. This was personal. They'd used his daughter as a test case, probably to see if they could manipulate him the way they manipulated other families. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from Lila, heading home to shower and get clothes. Back in an hour. Thank God Travis is taking such good care of Emma. The irony made him want to vomit. Instead, Ray made his way to Patricia Williams' station. The older nurse had been avoiding him since that first night, but now he understood why. She knew something about Lila's activities, but was too scared to speak up. We need to talk, Ray said, cornering Patricia near the medication lockup. She flinched away from him. I can't. I need to get back to work. Patricia. Ray's voice carried the authority of 15 years carrying a badge. Children are dying. Emma almost died. If you know something, you have a moral obligation to speak. The older woman's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked around to ensure they weren't overheard. I suspected for weeks, she whispered. Little things at first, medications going missing for bags that looked tampered with. Then I started noticing the pattern with Lila's patients. But who was going to believe me? She's married to a detective, and Dr. Kellerman vouches for her. What about Emma specifically? Patricia's face crumpled. I saw Lila in your daughter's room an hour before you arrived. She wasn't supposed to be working that floor, but she said she was checking on the new admission. When I came back 20 minutes later, Emma was in distress. The final piece clicked into place. Lila had deliberately poisoned their daughter, knowing Ray would bring her to the hospital where Travis could play the hero. It was the ultimate test of their control. Could they manipulate even a police detective? They were about to find out just how badly they'd miscalculated. Chapter 6. The Point of No Return. Ray Morrison sat in his car outside St. Mary's Hospital at 3 a.m., watching the building where his daughter fought for her life and his wife played out her twisted games. Emma was stable now, breathing on her own, but the doctors warned there could be lasting damage from whatever toxin had nearly killed her. In the passenger seat lay 3 manila folders, one containing Miguel's video evidence, another with Patricia Williams' signed statement, and the third holding Ray's own surveillance documentation of Lila and Travis's affair. Enough evidence to destroy both their careers and send them to prison for child endangerment, attempted murder, and a dozen other charges. But Ray wasn't thinking about legal justice anymore. He'd spent 20 years putting criminals behind bars, watching them serve reduced sentences, get parole, sometimes walk free on technicalities. He'd seen victims' families destroyed by a system that prioritized rehabilitation over retribution. His own daughter had become a victim of that same broken system, because he'd trusted it to protect the innocent while monsters wore scrubs and white coats. No more. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from Travis. Emma's responding well to treatment. You can rest easy knowing she's in good hands. The audacity was breathtaking. The man who'd helped poison his daughter was now playing concerned physician, probably getting off on Ray's gratitude and relief. Another text, this one from Lila, staying at hospital tonight to be close to Emma. Travis is being so wonderful. We're lucky to have him. Lucky indeed. Ray started his car and drove home to their empty house. He had work to do, and the clock was ticking. Lila would be back tomorrow morning to shower and change clothes. Travis would continue his rounds, basking in praise for his heroic efforts to save Emma. They both thought they'd won. In his basement, Ray opened a storage locker he hadn't touched in 5 years. Inside were tools from his military days. Before he'd become a cop, he'd been special forces for 8 years. Some skills never faded, and some equipment never became obsolete. The plan that formed in his mind was elegant in its brutality. Ray had learned from watching too many criminals make the same mistake. They let emotion drive their actions, becoming sloppy and desperate. He wouldn't make that error. This would be methodical, precise, and absolutely devastating. But first, he needed to ensure Emma's safety. As long as she remained in the hospital under Travis and Lila's care, she was vulnerable. Ray made a series of calls to colleagues, pulling in favors from his years on the force. By dawn, Emma had been quietly transferred to Children's Hospital across town under the care of Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric specialist Ray had met during previous cases. The transfer was presented as a consultation for Emma's unusual symptoms, but Ray had been explicit about his concerns regarding the staff at St. Mary's. You're saying you suspect medical abuse? Dr. Martinez had asked during their phone call. I'm saying my daughter nearly died under suspicious circumstances, and I want her somewhere safe while I investigate, Ray had replied. It wasn't quite the truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. With Emma secure, Ray returned to St. Mary's to watch his target's reactions. He arrived just as Lila was rushing through the ICU doors, panic written across her face. Where is she? She demanded at the nurse's station. Where's Emma? Mrs. Morrison, the charge nurse, said calmly. Your daughter was transferred for specialized care. Your husband authorized it. Transferred where? Lila's voice was rising, drawing attention from other families in the waiting area. Ray stepped out from behind a pillar. Children's Hospital. I wanted a second opinion on her condition. Relief flooded Lila's face so quickly that Ray almost missed the flash of something else. Fury, maybe, or frustration. Why didn't you tell me? I was terrified something had happened. It was a last-minute decision, Ray said, watching her carefully. Dr. Martinez wanted to run some specialized tests that aren't available here. I should have been consulted, Lila said, her anger now barely contained. I'm her mother, and I'm her father, Ray replied, his tone absolutely neutral. The father who found her dying in our living room while her mother stood by and did nothing. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Lila's face went white, then red with indignation. How dare you? Mrs. Morrison. Travis appeared beside them, his voice smooth and professional. I understand you're upset about Emma's transfer, but Children's Hospital has excellent facilities. I'm sure she'll receive wonderful care. Ray studied Travis's expression, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed his true feelings. The doctor was furious about losing control of Emma's case, but he was hiding it behind Concerned Physician Act. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Travis continued, glancing meaningfully at Lila. "Good idea," Ray said. "Why don't you both come to my house tonight? We can discuss Emma's care properly. Say around 9 o'clock. Lila and Travis exchanged glances, a look so loaded with communication that Ray almost laughed at their transparency. "I'm not sure Travis began. "I insist," Ray interrupted, his voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a request. "After all, you've both been so invested in Emma's well-being. The least I can do is make you dinner." As Ray walked away, he could feel their eyes boring into his back. They were probably wondering if he suspected something, if the transfer was random or deliberate, if they were in danger. They had no idea how right they were to be afraid. Tonight, Ray Morrison would begin evening the score. And by the time he was finished, Travis Kellerman and Lila Morrison would understand that some fathers couldn't be manipulated, threatened, or broken. Some fathers were apex predators who'd been sleeping. Until now. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. The Morrison house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac where neighbors minded their own business and thick oak trees provided natural privacy. Ray had chosen this location deliberately when he and Lila married. A detective's paranoia demanded secure surroundings. Tonight, that same paranoia would serve a darker purpose. At 8:45 p.m., Ray finished his preparations. The living room looked exactly as it had the night Emma nearly died, but appearances were deceiving. Hidden cameras captured every angle, and recording devices ensured nothing would be missed. In the kitchen, 3 wine glasses sat on the counter beside an expensive bottle of Cabernet. One glass treated with a carefully measured dose of Rohypnol, another with a paralytic agent Ray had acquired through military contacts, and a third completely clean for himself. Ray checked his watch, 8:55. They would arrive precisely on time, because punctuality was Travis's way of maintaining control in social situations. The doctor couldn't resist demonstrating his superiority through perfect manners and careful preparation. Headlights swept across the front windows as a silver BMW pulled into the driveway. Ray adjusted his hidden recording device and opened the door with a warm smile. "Travis, Lila," he said, embracing his wife and shaking hands with her lover. "Thank you for coming. I know this has been a difficult time for all of us." Travis was dressed in expensive casual wear, designer jeans, and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Lila wore a blue dress Ray had bought her for their anniversary last year. The irony wasn't lost on him. "How's Emma doing?" Lila asked as they settled in the living room. "Better," Ray replied, pouring wine with steady hands. "Dr. Martinez thinks she'll make a full recovery, though she's still running tests to determine what caused the respiratory distress." He handed Lila the glass treated with Rohypnol, not enough to cause serious harm, but sufficient to make her compliant and confused. Travis received the paralytic, a drug that would leave him conscious but unable to move. Ray kept the clean glass for himself. "To Emma's recovery," Ray said, raising his glass. They drank, and Ray felt a cold satisfaction as he watched his enemies consume their own destruction. The drugs would take 15 to 20 minutes to reach full effect. Plenty of time for the conversation Ray had planned. "Travis," Ray said conversationally, "how long have you been a pediatric emergency physician?" 8 years, Travis replied, settling back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man discussing his greatest passion. "I love working with children. They're so resilient, so trusting." "Trusting," Ray repeated, tasting the word. "That's interesting. Do you think that trust ever gets misplaced?" Something flickered in Travis's eyes, but his smile remained steady. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Well," Ray continued, "parents trust medical professionals with their children's lives. They believe doctors and nurses want to help, not harm. But what if that trust was misplaced? What if the people supposedly saving children were actually hurting them?" Lila shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "The Rohypnol," was beginning to affect her balance and judgment, making her less capable of maintaining the careful facades she'd worn for months. "Ray," she said, her voice slightly slurred, "what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about patterns, sweetheart," Ray replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the steel underneath. "For instance, the pattern of children under your care developing mysterious complications during night shifts. Or the pattern of Dr. Kellerman heroically saving those same children, building his reputation as a miracle worker." Travis set down his wine glass, and Ray noticed the slight tremor in his hand. The paralytic was starting to work. "That's quite an accusation," Travis said, trying to maintain his composed demeanor even as his body began betraying him. "I think grief over Emma's condition might be affecting your judgment." "My judgment is perfectly clear," Ray said. "Would you like to see the evidence?" He reached for the first manila folder, spreading crime scene photos across the coffee table. Not photos of Lila and Travis's medical crimes, photos from Ray's current caseload. Images of child abuse, domestic violence, murder scenes. 20 years of police work teaches you to recognize patterns, Ray said as his guest stared at the horrific images. "These are all cases I've worked recently. Parents who hurt their own children, caregivers who exploited the vulnerable, medical professionals who used their positions to abuse patients." Lila was now visibly struggling to focus, the drug making her disoriented and vulnerable. Travis remained alert, but Ray could see panic in his eyes as he realized his limbs weren't responding properly. "The justice system failed every one of these victims," Ray continued, his voice taking on a darker edge. "Reduced sentences, plea bargains, technicalities that let monsters walk free. But tonight, we're going to discuss a different kind of justice." He stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with a black duffel bag that he placed on the floor between his paralyzed guests. "Travis," Ray said, unzipping the bag to reveal an array of medical instruments, scalpels, syringes, bone saws, other tools that gleamed under the living room lights. "Since you're so fond of medical procedures, I thought you might appreciate these. Military field surgery equipment. Very effective for various purposes." Travis tried to speak, but found his vocal cords increasingly unresponsive. Only his eyes remained fully functional, and they were wide with terror as he began to understand his situation. "Lila," Ray continued, "you've always been fascinated by the effects of different drugs on the human body. Tonight, you got to experience that fascination from a new perspective." Ray pulled out a vial of clear liquid and a syringe, checking the dosage with professional precision. "This is succinylcholine, a paralytic agent that will leave you completely conscious while your body shuts down. It's the same drug you used on Emma. Actually, I thought it was appropriately poetic." The full horror of their situation was finally penetrating their drug-clouded minds. They were trapped in the home of a man they betrayed, poisoned and helpless, facing someone who knew exactly how to cause maximum pain while keeping them alive. Ray had spent 20 years studying the darkest aspects of human nature. Tonight, he was going to demonstrate everything he'd learned. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Ray Morrison moved with the methodical precision of a surgeon as he prepared his instruments, each tool laid out with the same care he'd once used to organize evidence at crime scenes. Travis and Lila sat paralyzed in their chairs, conscious but helpless, watching their executioner work with growing terror. "The beauty of succinylcholine," Ray said conversationally as he filled another syringe, "is that it mimics natural death. Respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, very difficult to detect in post-mortem examination unless you know what to look for." He injected Lila first, watching as the remaining mobility left her body. She could still breathe, still think, still feel everything, but she couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't escape. Travis received the same treatment, his eyes tracking Ray's movements with desperate intensity. Both of them understood now that this wasn't an interrogation or a confrontation. This was an execution disguised as medical procedure. "I want you to understand something," Ray said, settling into a chair across from them. "This isn't about the affair. I stopped caring about your pathetic relationship weeks ago. This is about Emma. He pulled out his laptop and opened the video files he'd compiled: Miguel's surveillance footage, hospital records, recorded phone conversations. "Did you really think you could poison my daughter and get away with it?" Ray asked, turning the screen so they could see the evidence of their crimes. "Did you think I was just another grieving father you could manipulate?" On the screen, Lila could see herself injecting substances into 4 bags, tampering with medications, creating the very emergencies that Travis would then heroically resolve. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. 17 children, Ray continued, his voice growing colder. 17 innocent children you poisoned, tortured, traumatized for your sick games. Some of them suffered permanent damage. The 5-year-old boy you put in a coma is still fighting for his life. Ray stood and moved to his surgical table, selecting a scalpel with the same care other men chose golf clubs. "Military field surgery teaches you interesting things about human anatomy," he said, testing the blade's sharpness against his thumb. "How much pain a body can endure while remaining conscious. How to keep someone alive through procedures that should kill them. How to make death take hours instead of minutes." The terror in their eyes was absolute now. They'd played games with children's lives, never considering that someone might play the same games with theirs. Ray began with Travis's fingers, precise cuts that severed tendons without hitting major arteries. The doctor's surgical hands, which had saved lives and destroyed them in equal measure, were methodically rendered useless. Travis couldn't scream, couldn't move, could only watch his career and his identity being dismantled one cut at a time. "Each finger represents a child you hurt," Ray explained clinically. "This little piggy went to market. This little piggy stayed home." Lila was forced to watch every moment, her own terror building as she realized her turn was coming. The Rohypnol had worn off enough for her to think clearly, but the paralytic kept her trapped in her own body. When Ray finished with Travis's hands, he moved to Lila. But his approach with her was different, more personal, more intimate in its cruelty. "You used to beg me to have another baby," Ray said, producing a different set of instruments. "You said Emma needed a sibling, that you wanted to give me more children. But the whole time, you were planning to hurt the daughter we already had." The gynecological tools Ray had acquired were designed for precision surgery, but in his hands they became instruments of poetic justice. Each cut, each procedure was carefully calculated to cause maximum psychological damage, along with the physical trauma. "This is for every night you came home from hurting children and kissed Emma goodnight," Ray said as he worked. "For every time you pretended to be a loving mother while planning her suffering." Hours passed. Ray worked with professional efficiency, keeping his victims conscious and aware throughout their ordeal. He'd studied the human breaking point extensively through his police work, knew exactly how much trauma a person could endure before shock set in. But Ray wasn't interested in mere death. He wanted confession, admission, acknowledgement of their crimes. "Tell me about the others," he said during one of his breaks, offering water to keep them hydrated enough to continue. "The children before Emma. How many hospitals? How many victims?" Travis's eyes held a plea for mercy that would never come. Lila's expression had moved beyond terror into something approaching madness. "I have all night," Ray continued, cleaning his instruments with antiseptic precision. "Actually, I have all weekend. Took vacation time from the department." Amazing how understanding they are when your child almost dies. As dawn approached, Ray made his final preparations. Both his victims were beyond pain now, existing in a twilight state between life and death. But they were still conscious, still aware of what was happening to them. "Any last words?" Ray asked, temporarily reversing the vocal paralysis with a carefully measured injection. Travis tried to speak, but could only produce a liquid wheeze. Too much damage to his throat from the night's work. Lila managed 2 words: "Please stop." Ray smiled for the first time since Emma's poisoning. "Did Emma say those words when you hurt her? Did any of the children you tortured beg you to stop?" He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he prepared the final injections, massive doses of potassium chloride that would stop their hearts within minutes. "Goodbye, Lila," Ray said, finding a vein in his wife's neck. "Say hello to hell for me." As the drugs took effect, Ray watched the life fade from their eyes with the same clinical detachment he'd once used to observe crime scenes. Justice, he reflected, wasn't always pretty, but was always necessary. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 3 months later, Ray Morrison sat in a coffee shop across from Children's Hospital, watching Emma play in the small playground visible through the window. His daughter had made a complete recovery, her resilience proving stronger than the poison that had nearly killed her. She laughed as she went down the slide, completely unaware of the darkness that had almost consumed her life. The official investigation into Lila and Travis's disappearance had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Two adults with access to drugs and medical knowledge, a history of risky behavior, and mounting evidence of medical malpractice. The FBI profilers theorized they'd fled the country rather than face prosecution. Their bodies were never found, and after 12 weeks, the case was quietly transferred to the Cold Case Division. Ray had returned to work after a brief bereavement leave, accepting condolences from colleagues who assumed his wife had abandoned him and Emma. The sympathy was genuine, and Ray played the role of the betrayed husband with convincing sincerity. After all, he wasn't entirely acting. Lila had betrayed him, just not in the way his fellow officers believed. Emma was thriving under the care of Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman from Ray's neighborhood who'd raised 6 children of her own. She didn't ask probing questions about Emma's mother's absence, accepting Ray's explanation that Lila had left to find herself, with the understanding of someone who'd seen marriage fall apart before. The hospital investigation had been more complex, but equally satisfying. Miguel Santos's video evidence, combined with Patricia Williams' testimony, had exposed the systematic patient abuse that had been occurring at St. Mary's. 17 families received substantial settlements, and the hospital implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar crimes. Most importantly, the 5-year-old boy Travis and Lila had put in a coma finally woke up. His recovery was incomplete. There would be lasting neurological damage, but he was alive, speaking, and learning to walk again. Ray had anonymously established a trust fund for the boy's ongoing medical care, funded by the liquidation of Travis's investment portfolio. As Ray sipped his coffee and watched Emma play, his phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. Emma's 6-month checkup shows perfect health. Whatever she went through, she's completely recovered. You should be proud. She's a remarkable little girl. Pride. Ray did feel proud, though not in the way Dr. Martinez intended. He was proud of the justice he'd delivered, the children he'd protected, the monsters he'd eliminated. The world was a safer place with Travis Kellerman and Lila Morrison gone, and Ray had no regrets about his methods. A young woman approached the playground with a toddler in tow, a mother bringing her child to play. Ray studied her automatically, his detective instincts cataloging details, nervous demeanor, protective positioning near her child, wary glances at other adults. Domestic violence victim, he assessed. Recent separation, still afraid of being found. For a moment, Ray considered approaching her, offering assistance. He had resources, connections, ways to help people disappear when necessary. But he caught himself. His vigilante days were over. Emma needed a father more than the world needed another dark night. Instead, Ray simply watched and waited, ready to intervene if necessary, but content to let others handle their own problems. He learned the hard way that trying to save everyone was a path to madness. Better to focus on protecting what mattered most. Emma ran over to the fence separating the playground from the coffee shop, waving at her father with the uncomplicated joy of a child who felt safe and loved. "Daddy," she called out, "come push me on the swings." Ray finished his coffee and headed outside, leaving a generous tip for the waitress. As he walked toward his daughter, he reflected on the conversation they would have someday, when Emma was old enough to understand why her mother wasn't coming back, why they'd moved to a new house, why Ray was sometimes distant and watchful. He would tell her the truth, eventually. Not all of it, but enough. Emma deserved to know that her father had protected her from monsters, that some people in the world meant children harm, that she should never trust blindly or assume good intentions. But for now, it was enough that she was safe, healthy, and happy. Ray pushed her on the swings as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the playground. Emma giggled and asked to go higher, trusting completely in her father's strong hands and his promise to never let her fall. Ray Morrison had learned many things in his 40 years of life. That evil often wore familiar faces, that justice wasn't always legal, that protecting innocence sometimes required becoming something monstrous yourself. But watching his daughter play in the fading light, he realized he'd learned something else as well. Love, real love, was worth any price, even the price of his own soul. As they walked home together, Emma chattering about her day, while holding Ray's hand, he made a silent promise to his daughter and to himself. The monsters were gone, the nightmares were over, and the future belonged to them. Ray Morrison, detective and father, had won the only war that truly mattered, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure the victory lasted. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.